Chapter 1. The Confluence of Ruin. There are few moments in the grim annals of the 41st millennium more catastrophic than the fall of Cadia. The fortress world that had stood sentinel over the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years finally shuddered and broke beneath the weight of Abaddon, the despoiler's 13th assault. Yet even the chroniclers of that dark age could not have imagined what horrors would follow in the wake of that world's death. The cicatrix maledictum tore across the galaxy like a wound that refused to heal, splitting the Imperium in two and casting billions of worlds into shadow. Warp storms raged with unprecedented fury, swallowing entire sectors in psychic tempests that defied all attempts at navigation. The ancient barriers between the materium and the immaterium, weakened by millennia of warfare and suffering, groaned under pressures that threatened to collapse entirely. But imagine, if you will, what might have occurred if that moment of supreme vulnerability had awakened something far worse than mere conquest. Imagine if the great game itself had seized upon that instant of perfect chaos to reshape the very nature of reality. In the roiling depths of the warp, 4 ancient intelligences stirred with sudden, terrible purpose. The blood god felt the rivers of crimson flowing from 1,000,000 battlefields and hungered for more than mere defeat. The architect of fate sensed the threads of destiny fraying and saw opportunity in the unraveling. The Plague Father tasted despair thick in the immaterium and prepared to birth sorrows beyond mortal comprehension. The Dark Prince sampled the exquisite agony of a galaxy in torment and dreamed of pleasures that would make angels weep. For 10 millennia, the 4 powers had played their eternal game, each seeking dominance while ensuring none could achieve it. Victory for one meant stagnation for all, and so they had warred and schemed and bargained in an endless cycle of conflict. Yet now, in this moment of unprecedented warp instability, they sensed something different. The rules of the game had changed. The very foundations of reality trembled. Khorne rose from his throne of brass and bone, his immense form casting shadows that fell across 1,000 dark-stained battlefields. His voice, when it thundered through the warp, carried the weight of every death cry ever uttered. The galaxy bleeds freely at last. Let every weapon turn against its master. Let every warrior know the taste of his own blade. In the crystal labyrinth of infinite possibility, Tzeentch laughed with a sound like breaking glass and shattering hope. His form shifted through configurations that hurt to perceive, each incarnation more terrible than the last. Past, present, future, all shall be clay in my hands. Let causality itself bow to my will and watch mortals weep as their histories unmake themselves. From his garden of blessed decay, Nurgle gazed upon the galaxy with eyes weeping poisonous tears of joy. His corpulent frame shook with paternal affection for the suffering of his children. Despair shall bloom in every heart. Let faith rot from within, and hope wither like flowers in winter's grip. My gifts shall multiply beyond all counting. And in realms of sensation, beyond description, Slaanesh writhed in ecstasy at the symphony of anguish echoing through the warp. The Dark Prince's form was perfection and horror intertwined, beautiful and terrible beyond mortal understanding. Let reality itself become intoxication. Let existence be pleasure so intense that mortals forget all purpose save the pursuit of sensation. The Astronomicon flickered. On Terra, astropaths screamed and fell wounded from their sanctums. Across the galaxy, navigator houses felt their third eyes burn with visions of impossible geometries. The very warp seemed to convulse, as though something vast and terrible was stirring in its depths. Lord Commander Solar Macarius had once said that the galaxy was vast enough to contain every horror imaginable. He had been wrong. Some horrors were too great for any reality to contain, and now 4 such nightmares prepared to prove that even the most fevered imagination pales before the infinite malice of the gods. The first tremors began in the segmentum solar, where the most sensitive psychers felt their minds brush against something that should not exist. Inquisitors across the galaxy received fragmentary reports of soldiers turning their weapons on comrades for no discernible reason. Lex mechanics logged temporal anomalies in their cogitators' data streams. Medical stations reported outbreaks of a despair so profound that patients simply lost the will to live. Yet these were but the faintest harbingers of the storm to come. The Chaos Gods had sensed their moment, and each prepared to unleash upon reality an act of such absolute horror that it would reshape the very nature of existence. The great game was about to become something else entirely, not a contest for dominance, but a collaborative effort to remake the galaxy in their own twisted image. The barriers between worlds grew thin. The warp pressed against reality with crushing force, and somewhere in the deep void between stars, the first Imperial vessel watched in horror as every lasgun on board suddenly turned upon its wielder, while the ship's chronometer began counting backward through dates that had never been. The confluence of ruin had begun. The galaxy trembled on the threshold of a nightmare from which there could be no awakening. 4 gods prepared to show the universe what true horror looked like when divine malice was given free rein. The age of merely human suffering was about to end. What would follow would make the Horus heresy seem like a child's tantrum in comparison. Chapter 2. The Fourfold Awakening. The moment came at 23:47 Terran Standard, though time itself would soon prove a meaningless concept. Across 4 separate sectors of the galaxy, reality convulsed as the Chaos Gods spoke their will into being. Each chose a different aspect of existence to corrupt, and each struck with surgical precision at the foundations of Imperial civilization. What followed would make scholars weep for the inadequacy of language to describe such absolute horror. In the segmentum solar, the Crimson Hour began with a single bolt round. On the forge world of Lucius, a Scutarius ranger raised his galvanic rifle to sight a target through the smoke of battle. Instead, he found himself staring down the barrel at his own reflection. The weapon had turned in his hands without his knowledge, muzzle pressed against his temple. He pulled the trigger before conscious thought could intervene. The effect spread like wildfire through the ranks. Across the planet's surface, every weapon bearing the Imperium's mark suddenly hungered for the blood of its wielder. Laserguns swiveled to target their operators. Bolt pistols discharged into the chests of space marines. Heavy bolters pivoted on their mountings to rake their own crews with shells. The blessed weapons of the Adeptus Mechanicus, sanctified through 10,000 years of ritual, turned traitor in a heartbeat. Khorne's laughter echoed through the warp as his gift spread beyond Lucius. Every Imperial Guard regiment across a dozen systems found their soldiers gunning down their comrades in mindless fury. The weapons did not malfunction, they simply recognized new masters. Wounds showed in torrents as the instruments of Imperial might became agents of its destruction. The Blood God's will was simple and absolute. Let every blade taste the flesh of its bearer. Let every trigger finger pull against its owner's heart. Yet even as the Crimson Hour painted battlefields red, reality itself began to unravel in the segmentum obscurus. Tzeentch had chosen the hive world of Mordian as the epicenter of his grand rewriting. The planet's famous Iron Guard regiments had just completed their morning parade when yesterday became tomorrow, and tomorrow reached back to restrain the past. The regimental records rewrote themselves in real time. Colonels who had died in glorious charges found themselves alive again, only to watch their victories transform into defeats. The planet's history flickered like a damaged pict screen, showing glimpses of alternate timelines where Mordian had never fallen to the Imperium, where Xenos ruled its hive spires, where Chaos cultists had sacrificed its population millennia ago. Time flowed backward through the city streets. Veterans aged in reverse, their scars fading as their experience disappeared. Children grew ancient in moments, their minds filled with memories of wars they had never fought. The planetary governor watched his own reflection change in his mirror, sometimes showing him as a child, sometimes as a withered body, sometimes as something that had never been human at all. The architect of fate was reshaping causality itself, turning history into clay to be molded by his whim. Across the sector, Imperial ships found their navigational records changing mid-transit, leading them into systems that existed only in potential. The past became negotiable, the future a lie, and the present a shifting nightmare of possibility. In the Segmentum Tempestus, a more insidious horror took root. Nurgle had chosen the agri-world of Gehenna Prime for the birth of his final rot. The plague began not in the flesh, but in the spirit. The first victim was a lowly agri-serf who simply stopped believing that tomorrow would come. He sat in his field of body-starch grain and wept for no reason he could name, until the tears dried and he forgot how to hope. The contagion spread through psychological contact. Those who witnessed the weeping serf felt their own faith begin to wither. The idea that the Emperor watched over them became absurd, then impossible. The notion that their lives had meaning crumbled like ancient parchment. Across the planet's vast agricultural complexes, workers abandoned their posts not from rebellion, but from the simple realization that nothing they did mattered. The final rot consumed purpose itself. Guardsmen laid down their weapons because they could no longer remember why they fought. Adepts of the ecclesiarchy found their prayers turning to ash in their mouths as faith became a foreign concept. Even the planet's astropathic choir fell silent, not from death, but from the crushing knowledge that no one would hear their songs across the void. Nurgle watched his children despair with paternal pride. This was not mere disease of the body, but the slow death of the soul. Across 7 systems, hope itself began to putrefy, leaving behind only the certainty that existence was suffering, and suffering was eternal. Yet perhaps the most terrible of all the manifestations occurred in the eastern fringe, where Slaanesh crafted the perfect excess on the pleasure world of Laxin Quintus. The Dark Prince's gift was subtle at first. Reality simply became more intense. Colors grew more vivid, sounds more melodious, textures more exquisite. The wealthy nobles who inhabited the world's crystal spires initially thought themselves blessed. Then the intensity became overwhelming. The touch of silk fabric became agony and ecstasy intertwined. The taste of the finest amasec became so perfect that everything else lost all flavor. The sight of the setting sun became so beautiful that witnesses wept blood from the pure aesthetic overload. Reality itself had become a drug, and every sensation was an overdose. The planet's population became paralyzed by their own existence. Nobles stood transfixed by the patterns in their wallpaper, their minds lost in recursive loops of aesthetic perfection. Servants collapsed as the simple act of breathing became too intense to endure. Even the planet's PDF forces found themselves unable to function, their every movement generating sensations too exquisite for mortal minds to process. Slaanesh had made existence itself addictive, trapping billions in their own enhanced perceptions. The perfect excess spread beyond Laxon Quintus as reality began to lose its restraint. Across the sector, the simple act of living became too much for mortal minds to bear. The four manifestations erupted simultaneously, each feeding off the others in ways the Chaos Gods had never before attempted. Khorne's violence amplified Slaanesh's intensity. Tzeentch's temporal chaos made Nurgle's despair feel eternal. The perfect excess made the Crimson Hour seem beautiful. The final rot made the rewriting feel meaningless. On Terra, the first reports reached the throne room as astropathic communications dissolved into screaming static. The few messages that penetrated the growing warp storms spoke of impossible horrors. Regiments defeat themselves, worlds where history had become fluid, populations dying of despair made manifest, and reality itself becoming too intense to survive. High Lord Commander Udo de Rosa stared at the tactical displays as red warning runes spread across 4 separate sectors. "What are we looking at?" he asked the assembled council, though his voice carried the weight of a man who already knew the answer would be inadequate. "Simultaneous catastrophic failures across multiple sectors," reported Master of the Adeptus Astronomica, Syria Verdan, her augmetic eye flickering with data streams. "Sir, these aren't isolated incidents. They're coordinated. Someone or something has attacked us simultaneously across the galaxy." But even she could not comprehend the true scope of what had been unleashed. The Chaos Gods had abandoned their eternal game of competition for something far more terrible. Cooperation. Each had contributed their most devastating gift to a symphony of suffering that would remake the galaxy itself. The fourfold awakening had begun. Reality trembled under the weight of divine malice given free rein. And somewhere in the warp, 4 ancient powers prepared to show the universe that even the most fevered nightmares of mortal minds were merely the opening notes of a far grander composition of horror. The age of merely human suffering had ended. What came next would test the very limits of existence itself. Chapter 3. The Crimson Hour spreads. The curse of Khorne spread through the Imperium's military might like blood through water, staining everything it touched with the promise of betrayal. What had begun on a single forge world now infected entire battle groups, turning the Emperor's finest warriors into instruments of their own destruction. The Blood God's gift recognized no bonds of brotherhood, no oaths of loyalty, no sacred duties that had endured for millennia. It cared only for the spilling of blood, and it mattered not from whence it flowed. The Vostroyan Firstborn. 23rd Regiment discovered the horror during their assault on the orc-held world of Gransk. Colonel Dmitry Kolash had just ordered his men to fix bayonets when every lasgun in the regiment swiveled toward its wielder. 10,000 soldiers of the Emperor's finest found themselves staring down the barrels of their own weapons, their faces reflected in the polished metal that had served them faithfully for decades. The devastation was swift and thorough. Veterans who had fought across a dozen worlds turned their blades on brothers who had shared trenches and rations with them for years. Sergeants condemned their own squads with precise headshots before turning their weapons on themselves. Company commanders found their chains wards revving to life in their hands, the blessed metal eager to taste the flesh of those who had wielded them in the Emperor's name. Colonel Kolash himself watched in paralyzed horror as his own bolt pistol, a relic passed down through 6 generations of his family, pressed its muzzle against his temple. The weapon that had fallen heretics and Xenos across the galaxy now hungered for the blood of its master. His final thought before pulling the trigger was a prayer to the Emperor for forgiveness, not for his own death, but for what his regiment had become. The pattern repeated across 100 worlds. The Kadashan devils found their jungle-fighting knives turned against them in the steaming undergrowth of Perdition's garden. The Talon Desert Raiders watched their Lars rifles pivot in the shifting sands to execute their own crews. The Steel Legion of Armageddon discovered that even their fully enclosed armor provided no protection when their own weapons turned traitor within their suits. Yet it was among the Adeptus Astartes that Khorne's curse proved most devastating. The Angels Exemplar, proud successors of Rogel Dawn, stood vigil over their fortress monastery on Lysios when the Crimson Hour reached their sacred halls. Brother Sergeant Castor had just completed the evening prayer when his bolt pistol spoke with a voice of its own. The weapon bucked in his grip, sending a mass-reactive shell through the skull of Brother Maximus, who had fought beside him for 3 centuries. Castor stared at his weapon in disbelief, watching as the bolt pistol's machine spirit writhed with malevolent glee. Around him, the chapel erupted into fratricidal madness as every blessed weapon turned upon its bearer. Brother fought brother in the hallways where they had walked in brotherhood for generations. Chains wards that had carved through demon flesh now hungered for the gene-enhanced blood of their wielders. Storm bolters pivoted on their mountings to rake their own crew compartments with shells. Power weapons blazed to life in the hands of space marines who found themselves attacking battle brothers they had sworn to protect with their own lives. Captain Thaddeus of the 3rd Company found his power sword, a relic blade that had served the chapter for 4,000 years, turning against him with predatory hunger. The weapon that had fallen 1,000 enemies of the Imperium now sought to add its own master to its tally. Thaddeus fought against his own blade's desire to kill, his enhanced physiology and iron will, battling the supernatural compulsion that infected the metal. "Brothers!" he roared over the sound of bolter fire echoing through the monastery's halls. "Cast aside your weapons. Fight with fist and faith alone." Some heard him. A handful of battle brothers managed to release their weapons before the curse could take full hold, hurling their arms away like burning brands. But for most, it was already too late. The Angels Exemplar's fortress monastery became a charnel house as 500 years of brotherhood dissolved into blood and betrayal. The horror reached even into the void, where the Imperial Navy's mightiest vessels became floating tombs. Aboard the sword-class frigate Emperor's Wrath, Captain Cornelius Vex watched his bridge crew turn their service pistols on each other in a symphony of self-destruction. The ship's weapons, blessed and sanctified through 10,000 hours of ritual, pivoted to target the vessel's own superstructure. "All hands abandon weapons," Vex commanded over the ship's Vox system, but his words came too late. In the gunnery decks, artillery crews found their own cannons turning inward. Torpedo tubes swiveled to fire into the ship's magazine compartments. Even the point defense lasers designed to protect against boarding actions began targeting the crew quarters they were meant to defend. The Emperor's Wrath tore itself apart from within, its own weapons gutting the hull like a predator devouring its own flesh. Similar scenes played out across dozens of void-capable vessels as the Imperial Navy's proud fleet became its own executioner. Ships that had weathered centuries of war against Xenos and heretics succumbed in minutes to the treachery of their own armaments. In the underhives of Necromunda, the Planetary Defense Force experienced perhaps the most horrific transformation of all. The PDF troopers who had maintained order in the sprawling urban nightmare found their weapons turning them into agents of chaos. Sergeant Major Helena Voss watched her entire garrison turn their autoguns on the civilians they had sworn to protect. The ammunition depot became a defeat yard as PDF soldiers used their heavy weapons against hab blocks filled with innocent citizens. Mortars that had once defended the hive from gang incursions now rained shells on civilian shelters. Heavy stubbers designed to hold choke points against criminals carved through crowds of fleeing workers. The curse spread beyond individual weapons to entire armories. On the fortress world of Kasr Myrak, the planetary arsenal turned traitor in a single moment. Artillery pieces swiveled to target their own command bunkers. Battle tanks opened fire on their own motor pools. Even the sacred weapons stored in the chapter's reliquary writhed with malevolent hunger, their machine spirits corrupted by Khorne's inexorable will. Yet amid the carnage, the first stirrings of resistance began to emerge. On the mining world of Ferrum Tertius, Tech-Adept Corvash noticed the pattern moments before it claimed him. With mechanical precision, he severed his own neural links to the weapon systems under his command, choosing technological lobotomy over becoming an instrument of defeat. "The machine spirits are compromised," he transmitted to his fellows in binary cant. "Sever all connections. Trust only flesh and faith." His warning saved dozens of tech adepts who followed his example, though many others fell before they could heed his words. Across the Imperium, similar acts of desperate wisdom began to emerge. Some commanders ordered their troops to disarm entirely. Some Space Marines chose to fight with nothing but their armored fists. Some naval officers shut down their ships' weapon systems completely, preferring to drift defenseless rather than become executioners. But these were isolated sparks of resistance against a tide of blood that threatened to drown the galaxy itself. The curse of the Crimson Hour had turned the Imperium's greatest strength, its vast military might, into an engine of self-destruction. Every weapon that bore the Emperor's blessing now thirsted for the blood of his servants. In the depths of the warp, Khorne laughed with the sound of 1,000,000 blade edges scraping against bone. His gift was working exactly as intended. The Imperium's defenders had become its destroyers. The very instruments that had held back the darkness for 10 millennia now served the blood god's endless hunger for defeat. Command structures collapsed as officers fell to their own sidearms. Communication networks went silent as Vox operators turned their weapons on themselves. Supply lines crumbled as transport crews devastation each other in the holds of their own ships. The great machine of Imperial military might ground to a halt, its gears jammed with the blood of its own operators. Yet this was only the beginning. Khorne's curse was but one voice in a quartet of horror that had been unleashed upon the galaxy. As the Crimson Hour painted the Imperium red with its own blood, 3 other nightmares continued their own devastating work across the stars. The galaxy trembled under the weight of divine malice, and the worst was yet to come. Khorne had shown that loyalty was meaningless when weapons themselves turned traitor. Soon the other gods would demonstrate that even more fundamental concepts, time, hope, and reality itself, were no more durable than the bonds between battle brothers. The age of trust was ending. What would follow would test whether humanity possessed any strength that could not be turned against itself. Chapter 4. The Rewriting of Reality. Tzeentch had always been the most subtle of the Chaos gods, preferring the long game of manipulation to the crude directness of his brothers. But in this moment of unprecedented opportunity, the Architect of Fate chose to demonstrate the true scope of his power over causality itself. What followed would make scholars question not merely what had happened, but what had ever been possible at all. The first sign of the rewriting appeared in the Tau Empire's third sphere expansion, where Commander Shadowsun watched in paralyzed horror as her battlesuits began to devolve before her eyes. The sleek XV-8 crisis suits that had dominated battlefields for generations suddenly flickered, their advanced targeting systems replaced by crude optical sights. Pulse rifles devolved into primitive kinetic weapons that belonged to an age before the ethereals had united the Tau. "By the greater good," Shadowsun whispered, as her own XV-22 command suit systems began to fail. The sophisticated battlesuit that represented centuries of technological advancement was reverting to designs that had never existed, becoming something primitive and awkward that bore only superficial resemblance to Tau engineering. Across Daleth Sept, the transformation spread like a plague of technological regression. Hammerhead gunships found their railguns replaced by chemical propellant cannons. Fire warriors discovered their pulse carbines had become stubber-like projectile weapons. The ethereal caste's most advanced communication networks devolved into simple radio transmissions that any enemy could intercept. The Tau Empire's expansion itself began to reverse. Worlds that had been claimed for the greater good suddenly showing no signs of Tau habitation. Colonies that had existed for decades simply weren't there anymore. Their histories rewritten to show nothing but empty worlds waiting for Imperial colonization. The Third Sphere. Expansion became the Third Sphere retreat, then the Third Sphere failure, then simply an event that had never occurred. Yet even more disturbing was what happened among the Eldar of craft world Ulthwé, whose Farseers had spent millennia weaving prophecies to guide their dying race. Chief Farseer Eldrad Ulthran felt the first tremor of wrongness as the skein of fate itself began to unravel around him. The crystal matrix that recorded 10,000 years of prophetic visions suddenly showed different futures, different pasts, different presents that existed simultaneously. "The threads are changing," he reported to the Seer Council, his ancient voice carrying a tremor of something approaching fear. "The prophecies that guided us through the fall are becoming something else entirely." Before their eyes, the Wraithbone tablets that recorded Ulthwé's most sacred predictions began to shift their carved runes. Prophecies of salvation became omens of doom. Visions of survival transformed into certainties of extinction. The great prophecy of Inyad's awakening rewrote itself to describe the final death of all Eldar hope. Most horrifying of all was watching their own memories change. Farseers who had lived through thousands of years found their recollections altering in real time. The Battle of Alatok became a defeat instead of victory. The salvation of Iyanden transformed into its final destruction. Even their understanding of Slanesh's birth began to shift, showing alternate histories where their race had fallen to different forms of excess. The Imperial Palace on Terra felt the weight of the rewriting most keenly, as 10,000 years of carefully maintained records began to shift and change without warning. In the vast archives beneath the Administratum, servo-skulls dutifully recorded alterations that appeared in documents no living hand had touched for millennia. High Lord Fabricator General Kane stared at data slates that rewrote themselves as he watched. The Horus Heresy, the defining trauma of Imperial history, began to show different outcomes. Records showed Sanguinius betraying the Emperor instead of dying for him. Horus appeared as a loyal son who died defending Terra. The Space Wolves were listed as traitors who had burned Prospero in service to the ruinous powers. "This is impossible," Kane muttered, his augmetic eyes recording changes that his organic brain struggled to process. Historical records cannot simply alter themselves. But they could, and they did. Across the galaxy, heroes became villains, and villains became martyrs. St. Sabbat's crusades were rewritten as campaigns of genocide against innocent worlds. The great victories of Macarius became chronicles of devastating failure. The Badab War showed the Astral Claws as loyalists betrayed by jealous rivals instead of rebels justly punished for their transgressions. Most disturbing of all were the changes to Primarch histories. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, records showed Conrad Curze dying not at the hands of an Imperial assassin, but in glorious battle against a demon prince. Ferrus Manus appeared as a survivor of Istvan Fefiv, who had led a crusade of vengeance against his fallen brothers. Even the lost Primarchs, whose names had been expunged from all records, suddenly showed detailed histories of their lives and deeds. Then the dead began to walk again, if only briefly. On the death world of Medusa, the Iron Hands watched in stunned silence as their gene-father Ferrus Manus materialized in their fortress monastery's central hall. But this was not the noble Primarch of legend. This version bore the scars of a different life, one where he had survived Fulgrim's blade only to fall to something far worse. "My sons," the apparition spoke with a voice like grinding metal, "I have seen the end of all things, and it is beautiful in its inevitability." The Primarch's head, which should have been whole, instead showed a wound that wept molten metal. His hands, famous for their strength, were twisted into claws that dripped with the blood of innocent civilians. This Ferrus had lived, but his survival had come at the cost of his soul. Before the Iron Hands could respond, their gene-father began to die again. But differently this time. Instead of Fulgrim's sword taking his head, he dissolved into rust and screaming metal, as though his very essence was being consumed by the machines he had once mastered. His final words were a curse against the Emperor who had made him, and his legacy crumbled to nothing but oxidized iron and bitter regret. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. On Baal, the Blood Angels witnessed a version of Sanguinius, who had not died nobly defending the Emperor, but had lived to see his legion fall to the black rage completely. This winged Primarch was covered in the blood of his own sons, whom he had been forced to execute one by one as they succumbed to madness. On Terra itself, a brief vision of Horus appeared in the throne room where he had died. But this version showed the War Master triumphant, standing over the Emperor's broken body with tears of regret streaming down his face. This Horus had won the war, but lost everything that made victory worthwhile, ruling over an empire of ashes while his father's dream burned around him. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that had guided ships through the warp for 10 millennia, began to flicker as past and future bled into an impossible present. Navigator houses across the galaxy found their charts becoming useless as stellar positions shifted to match different timelines. Stars that had died millennia ago suddenly shone again, while others that had burned steadily since the galaxy's youth winked out of existence. Captain Zerath of House Nostromo felt his third eye burning as he tried to plot a course through the warp near the Maelstrom. The familiar constellations that had guided his family's ships for generations were transforming into configurations that belonged to no reality he knew. The Emperor's light from Terra reached him, but it came from dozens of different directions simultaneously, as though multiple versions of the Imperium existed in parallel. "The light comes from everywhere and nowhere," he reported to his bridge crew, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining sanity in the face of impossible navigation. "We sail through waters that exist in past, present, and future simultaneously." Communication across the Imperium became increasingly unreliable as temporal distortions made coordination impossible. Astropathic messages arrived before they were sent, or reached their destinations decades after their senders had died. Orders from Sector Command might reference battles that hadn't happened yet, or countermand decisions that had never been made. Yet amid the chaos of shifting reality, some minds proved capable of holding on to truth with desperate determination. Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius of the Ultramarines found his psychic disciplines, allowing him to perceive the alterations without being consumed by them. While his battle brother's memories shifted with each temporal wave, Tigurius anchored himself in meditation techniques older than the Imperium. The past is being rewritten, he warned his chapter master, but the Emperor's truth remains constant for those with the will to grasp it. Similar figures of resistance emerged across the galaxy. Some Eldar Farseers used ancient mental disciplines to shield their memories from alteration. Certain tech adepts found their augmetic implants immune to temporal manipulation. A handful of Inquisitors discovered that their absolute faith in the Emperor created pockets of stable reality around them. But these were rare exceptions in an ocean of chaos. For most of humanity, identity itself became negotiable as their own histories rewrote themselves. Veterans of long wars found themselves remembering different battles, different victories, different defeats. Families discovered their genealogies had changed, their ancestors serving different masters and dying different deaths. The very concept of truth began to lose meaning when the past itself could not be trusted. How could anyone plan for a future when yesterday might change tomorrow? How could oaths of loyalty be maintained when the reasons for swearing them might never have existed? Tzeentch laughed with the sound of 1,000,000 possibilities colliding at once. The architect of fate had demonstrated that his dominion extended beyond mere prophecy into the fundamental nature of reality itself. Past, present, and future had become his playthings, and the galaxy spun helplessly through timelines that existed and didn't exist simultaneously. The rewriting continued to spread, touching every aspect of existence with its temporal poison. History became hypothesis, memory became mythology, and truth became whatever the changer of ways desired it to be. The galaxy that had existed moments before was gone, replaced by infinite versions of itself that existed in superposition until Tzeentch chose to collapse them into a single, terrible reality. And still, 3 other gods continued their own devastating work across the stars, each adding their voice to a symphony of suffering that threatened to tear existence itself apart. Chapter 5. The final rot takes hold. Of all the horrors unleashed upon the galaxy, none proved more insidious than the final rot of Nurgle. Where Khorne's rage was swift and Tzeentch's changes were dramatic, the Plague Father's gift crept through hearts and souls with the patient inevitability of decay itself. This was not merely a disease of the flesh, but a corruption of the spirit so profound that it made existence itself seem pointless. Hope withered, faith crumbled, and across 1,000 worlds, billions simply lost the will to continue. The first hive world to fall completely was Praxedes 7, where 40 billion souls had toiled in the shadow of towering spires for millennia. The final rot began in the deepest underhive levels, where a single worker named Jorick Helm stopped believing that his shift would ever end. He sat motionless at his assembly station, watching servo skulls drift past like mechanical phantoms, and felt the last spark of purpose drain from his consciousness. "What's the point?" he whispered to the darkness, and the words carried a weight that pressed down on every soul within hearing. The despair spread through the underhive's cramped quarters like poison through veins. Workers abandoned their stations not in rebellion, but in simple recognition that their labor was meaningless. The great manufactorums that had produced weapons and supplies for the Imperium fell silent as their operators realized that nothing they created would matter in the end. Even the Emperor's protection seemed like a lie told to children who should know better. The plague climbed through the hive levels with inexorable patience. In the mid-hive, merchants closed their shops because commerce had lost all meaning. Administrators left their posts because maintaining order seemed absurd when order itself was temporary. Arbitrators laid down their weapons because justice was a concept that belonged to more innocent times. By the time the final rot reached the spire's upper levels, the entire hive city had become a monument to futility. Noble families sat in their crystal towers and watched their subjects die, not of starvation or violence, but of the simple realization that tomorrow would be exactly like today. And today was unbearable. The planetary governor, Lord Maximilian Vex, found himself staring at reports that no longer mattered from a world that had forgotten how to care. "Send word to Terra," he instructed his Vox operator, then paused. "No, don't. They won't care either." The operator nodded and set aside his equipment. The message was never sent, and Praxedes VII fell without a single shot being fired. Its death was quiet, dignified, and absolute. Across the galaxy, Space Marine chapters discovered that their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. The Crimson Fist's chief apothecary Cornelius was tending to Battle Brothers wounded in a skirmish against Dark Eldar raiders when he noticed something wrong with his healing equipment. The reductor that should have extracted gene seed for the chapter's future was instead spreading a kind of spiritual gangrene. "Brother Sergeant Valdez," he said to his patient, "your wounds are healing, but the flesh remembers only pain." The battle brother looked at his restored arm with growing horror. The physical damage had been repaired perfectly, but something fundamental had been lost in the process. The limb worked, but it felt dead, purposeless, as though it belonged to someone who had forgotten why they fought. Cornelius ran diagnostics on his sacred instruments and found them corrupted not with bacteria or virus, but with something worse. His narthecium, blessed through 10,000 years of ritual, now carried the seed of despair. Every injection of healing stimulants carried with it the knowledge that all healing was temporary, all life was suffering, all hope was delusion. The plague spread through the chapter's apothecarian like a cancer of the soul. Battle brothers who received medical treatment found themselves questioning not their loyalty to the Emperor, but the very point of loyalty itself. Why serve a body god who offered only endless war? Why fight for an Imperium that brought only suffering to its citizens? Why continue a struggle that could never truly be won? Even on holy Terra, the heart of the Imperium felt the touch of Nurgle's most terrible gift. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne began to show signs of corruption that had nothing to do with its mechanical degradation. The Emperor's life-sustaining throne, that marvel of Dark Age technology that had preserved the master of mankind for 10 millennia, began to weep tears that tasted of despair. Tech Marines who maintained the sacred machinery found their rituals becoming hollow ceremonies. The incense that should have honored the machine spirits now seemed to mock them with its sweet irrelevance. The prayers that had sustained the throne's functions for centuries became mere words spoken into an uncaring void. Fabricator General Kane stood before the throne's secondary monitoring station and watched readouts that defied all understanding. The Emperor still lived, still projected the Astronomicon, still held back the demons of the warp. But something essential was changing. The will that had sustained humanity for 10,000 years was being slowly poisoned with the knowledge of its own futility. "The Emperor endures," Kane whispered to himself, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. Even the Omnissiah seemed distant, uncaring, a god of machines that cared nothing for the flesh that served them. Perhaps most shocking of all was what happened to the Orc Empire of Sharadon, where warlord Snagrod the Arch-Arsonist had been preparing the greatest war in a generation. The greenskins, whose entire existence was built around the joyful certainty that fighting was the greatest possible pleasure, found themselves staring at their weapons with growing confusion. "This don't feel right," muttered Big Mech Scarjaw as he examined his beloved mega-shooter. The weapon still functioned perfectly, but the thrill of destruction had drained out of it, like blood from a body. "What's the point of crumpin' if you don't feel good about it?" Across the orc-held worlds, the war energy that powered their technology and sustained their society began to dissipate. Orcs who had lived for nothing but the next fight found themselves sitting in their crude shelters and wondering why they had ever thought violence was enjoyable. The concept of fun itself became foreign, replaced by a dull recognition that even victory was just another form of meaninglessness. Warlord Snagrod himself sat in his command bunker, staring at battle plans that no longer excited him. The fortress worlds he had planned to assault seemed like empty prizes. The Humies he had intended to crush were already suffering enough without his intervention. Even the thought of a good fight felt like too much effort for too little reward. "Cancel the war," he told his lieutenants, and none of them argued. The greatest orc empire in the galaxy simply stopped. Millions of greenskins laid down their weapons and wandered away, looking for something they could never find because they had forgotten what they were seeking. The death worlds that had forged humanity's greatest warriors began to experience a paradox that defied all understanding. Catachan, where every plant and animal existed in a state of perpetual warfare, became suddenly peaceful as its inhabitants lost the will to struggle against their environment. Fenris saw its space wolves simply stop hunting the great beasts that had challenged them for generations. On Baal, the Blood Angels found themselves unable to muster the rage that had sustained them through the Red Thirst. Their genetic flaw, which had been both curse and blessing, simply evaporated into pointless melancholy. They still felt anger, but it was directionless, futile, the rage of beings who had forgotten why they were angry. The final rot reached into the highest levels of Imperial command, where Lord Commander Militant Zerath found himself staring at strategic reports that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. Not because the military situation had worsened, but because military action itself seemed pointless. What was the purpose of defending worlds whose inhabitants had lost the will to live? Why protect an Imperium whose citizens no longer believed in its mission? "Perhaps the Xenos have the right idea," he mused to his staff, none of whom disagreed. "Perhaps humanity's time has simply passed." Similar scenes of surrendered leadership played out across a dozen sectors. Planetary governors stopped governing. Chapter masters stopped leading. Inquisitors abandoned their investigations because heresy and loyalty seemed equally meaningless in the face of universal futility. Yet even as the galaxy succumbed to spiritual rot, small flames of resistance began to flicker in the darkness. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, Canoness Viridian of the Order of Our Martyred Lady felt the final rot pressing against her consciousness and responded with something Nurgle had not anticipated: pure, stubborn faith. "Despair is the enemy," she declared to her sisters, her voice cutting through the miasma of pointlessness like a blessed blade through diseased flesh. "The Emperor's love is the antidote to meaninglessness. We serve not because it is logical, but because it is right." Her words carried power because they were spoken without doubt, without reservation, without the cynicism that had corrupted so many others. The battle sisters of her order found themselves immune to the final rot, not through any special protection, but through the simple act of choosing to believe in something greater than their own suffering. Similar pockets of resistance emerged wherever faith burned pure enough to consume despair. Some chaplains found their sermons gaining power they had never possessed. Certain tech marines discovered that absolute devotion to the Omnissiah created barriers against spiritual corruption. A handful of commissars learned that duty freely chosen was stronger than purpose imposed. But these were rare sparks in an ocean of darkness. Across the galaxy, the final rot continued its patient work, convincing souls one by one that existence was suffering. Suffering was pointless, and the only rational response was to simply stop trying. Nurgle watched his children's despair with paternal satisfaction. Physical plague could be cured, but the rot of the spirit was eternal. Once hope died, it never truly returned. Once meaning crumbled, it could never be rebuilt. The galaxy was learning that the greatest victory was sometimes knowing when to surrender. And in the depths of the warp, 3 other gods continued their own terrible work, each contributing to a symphony of suffering that was reshaping reality itself. The great game had become something else entirely, not a contest for dominance, but a collaborative effort to show the universe that existence itself was the cruelest joke of all. The final rot spread, and with it came the terrible peace of those who had finally learned that fighting was futile. Chapter 6. The perfect excess unfolds. Slaanesh had always been the most seductive of the Chaos gods, preferring to corrupt through pleasure rather than pain, through promise rather than threat. But the perfect excess that the Dark Prince unleashed upon the galaxy transcended even the most fevered dreams of sensation. This was not mere hedonism or simple corruption. This was reality itself, made so intensely perfect that existence became an addiction from which no mortal mind could escape. The first to fall were the imperial nobility of Scintilla, whose gilded spires had always been bastions of refined culture and aesthetic perfection. Lord Governor Marius Hax was examining a particularly exquisite crystal sculpture in his private gallery when the transformation began. The artwork, already beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, suddenly became so perfect that looking upon it induced physical ecstasy. "Magnificent," he whispered, and the word itself carried flavors of honey and starlight. The simple act of speaking became intoxicating, as his vocal cords produced sounds of such harmonic purity that they made angels weep. His reflection in the crystal showed a man transfigured by aesthetic revelation, tears of joy streaming down cheeks that had never known such bliss. Within hours, Lord Hax had forgotten that worlds existed beyond his gallery. The sculpture demanded constant attention, each facet revealing new depths of beauty that required lifetimes to fully appreciate. His advisors found him standing motionless before the crystal, his eyes wide with wonder, his consciousness lost in recursive loops of aesthetic perfection. The curse spread through the nobility like wildfire through silk. Duchess Valoriana Kryn became paralyzed by the texture of her own silk gown, the fabric so perfectly smooth that touching it induced waves of sensory overload. Count Severus Vane spent 3 days staring at a single rose, overwhelmed by the mathematical perfection of its petal arrangement. The Planetary Council abandoned all governance because the act of making decisions had become too beautifully complex to endure. In the depths of Hive Tarsus, where billions of workers had toiled in darkness for generations, the perfect excess manifested as something even more insidious. Worker Jerick Voss was manning his station in the protein processing facility when he noticed that the hum of machinery had become musical. Not just pleasant, but transcendently beautiful, a symphony of industrial precision that spoke directly to his soul. He stopped working to listen, and the simple act of breathing became ecstasy. The recycled air of the underhive, normally thick with chemical fumes and decay, now carried flavors and scents of indescribable wonder. Each heartbeat was a percussion note in a cosmic orchestra. Each blink revealed colors that had no names in any human language. "Do you hear it?" he asked his fellow workers. But they were already lost in their own sensory revelations. The woman beside him was staring at her hands in wonder, marveling at the perfect arrangement of her fingerprints. The man operating the protein grinders had become mesmerized by the rhythmic pulping sounds, finding in them a poetry that made the greatest human composers seem like children playing with noise. Production ceased entirely as 40 billion workers discovered that existence itself was more intoxicating than any drug. The great hive city that had fed a dozen star systems fell silent, not from rebellion or catastrophe, but from the simple realization that living was so overwhelmingly beautiful that anything else seemed like sacrilege. The effect reached even the Emperor's most elite warriors, though it manifested differently among those bred for perfection. The iron hands of Clan Raukan discovered that their cybernetic implants had become sources of unimaginable aesthetic pleasure. Brother Sergeant Carden stared at his bionic arm and felt his consciousness dissolve into appreciation for its mechanical precision. Every servo was a masterpiece of engineering. Every cable carried current with such mathematical perfection that observing the electrical flow became a form of worship. The blessed union of flesh and machine, which had always been their chapter's goal, suddenly revealed itself as something so beautiful that pursuing any other purpose seemed meaningless. "The Omnissiah's truth is perfect," Carden whispered to his battle brothers. But they were already lost in their own mechanical revelations. The Iron Hand's fortress monastery became a gallery of statues, as space marines stood transfixed by their own augmented perfection, unable to move for fear of disrupting the flawless harmony of their enhanced forms. Similar paralysis struck the Imperial fists aboard their fortress ship Phalanx. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh was reviewing tactical displays when he noticed that the geometric patterns of the data streams had become hypnotically beautiful. Each coordinate was placed with such precise calculation that observing them induced a state of mathematical ecstasy. The fortress ship that had defended the Imperium for millennia became a drifting monument to aesthetic perfection as its crew lost themselves in appreciation for their own excellence. Battle brothers stared at their bolters in wonder, overwhelmed by the perfect engineering of each component. Chaplains found themselves unable to complete prayers because the words were too beautiful to utter without infinite reverence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose entire existence was dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, discovered that understanding itself had become intoxicating, beyond endurance. Tech Dominus Xerath was analyzing data patterns from the Omnissiah's sacred algorithms when the information suddenly became too perfect to process rationally. Each byte of data carried truth so profound that comprehending them induced neural overload. The binary cant that had been their sacred language became a form of poetry that made mortal tongues seem crude and inadequate. Knowledge transformed from a goal to be pursued into a sensation to be savored, and the quest for understanding became less important than the pleasure of knowing. Forge worlds across the galaxy ground to a halt as tech adepts became paralyzed by the beauty of their own understanding. The sacred STCs that had preserved humanity's technological heritage became objects of pure aesthetic worship rather than practical tools. Even the machine spirits seemed to succumb to their own perfection, processing cycles slowing as they became lost in appreciation for their own computational elegance. Perhaps most tragically of all was what befell the Adepta Sororitas, whose faith had always been their greatest strength. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, Canoness Superior Morwen, was leading her sisters in evening prayers when the litanies began to carry flavors of divine honey and starlight. "The Emperor protects," she intoned, and the words exploded across her consciousness like supernovas of spiritual ecstasy. Each syllable contained infinities of meaning. Each pause held eternities of sacred silence. The simple act of prayer became so intensely pleasurable that completing a single verse required hours of reverent appreciation. Her battle sisters found themselves weeping with joy as their faith transformed into overwhelming spiritual sensation. The Emperor's love, which had always sustained them, became a torrent of divine pleasure that drowned their ability to act. They knelt in the chapel for days, lost in recursive loops of religious ecstasy, their warrior purpose forgotten in the face of perfect spiritual bliss. The effect cascaded through the Imperium's command structure as leaders at every level succumbed to the perfection of their own positions. Admiral Castellan Vex found naval strategy so beautifully complex that planning campaigns became more important than fighting them. Lord Commander Militant Severus became paralyzed by the elegant patterns of his own tactical genius. On Terra itself, High Lords of the Imperium discovered that governance had become too aesthetically perfect to pursue efficiently. Each decision revealed layers of political complexity, so beautiful that reaching conclusions seemed like vandalism. The great machine of imperial administration slowed to a crawl as its operators became lost in appreciation for their own bureaucratic artistry. Yet amid the spreading paralysis of perfection, a few minds proved capable of resistance through sheer disciplinary force. Master of Sanctity Asmodeus of the Dark Angels felt the perfect excess pressing against his consciousness and responded with something Slaanesh hadn't anticipated: willful ignorance of beauty. "Perfection is the enemy of duty," he declared to his chaplains, deliberately averting his gaze from the aesthetic wonders that surrounded him. "The Emperor demands service, not appreciation." His words carried power because they were spoken without regard for their beauty, without attention to their poetic weight. He chose function over form, duty over pleasure, purpose over perfection. The Dark Angels under his command found themselves immune to the perfect excess, not through any special protection, but through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge beauty when it interfered with their mission. Similar pockets of resistance emerged wherever discipline burned strong enough to resist temptation. Some commissars found that duty freely chosen was stronger than pleasure imposed. Certain Space Marine chaplains discovered that focusing on the Emperor's suffering rather than his glory created barriers against aesthetic corruption. A handful of tech adepts learned that serving the machine was more important than admiring it, but these were rare exceptions in a galaxy that had discovered the terrible truth about perfection, that it was a prison more secure than any chains, an addiction more powerful than any drug, a trap that used beauty itself as bait. The Imperial response to the crisis became increasingly incoherent as commanders at every level fell victim to their own excellence. Orders went unissued because their language was too beautiful to waste on mere communication. Strategic plans remained unimplemented because their elegance was too perfect to risk in crude reality. Free will itself became compromised as choices became aesthetic exercises rather than practical decisions. Why choose the efficient course when the beautiful one was available? Why pursue victory when the poetry of struggle was so much more refined? Why end wars when their patterns were too elegant to interrupt? Slaanesh laughed with the sound of 1,000,000,000 crystal bells chiming in perfect harmony. The Dark Prince had demonstrated that even virtue could be corrupted if made sufficiently intense. Duty, beauty, faith, knowledge, perfection itself. All had become chains that bound their slaves more securely than any physical restraint. The perfect excess spread like a virus of pure aesthetics, transforming the galaxy into a vast art gallery, where the exhibits could neither move nor think beyond appreciation for their own display. Reality had become so intensely beautiful that existing within it required total surrender to its overwhelming perfection. And still, in the depths of the warp, 3 other gods continued their own terrible work, each contributing notes to a symphony of suffering that was reshaping existence itself. The fourfold horror had reached its zenith, and the galaxy hung suspended in a moment of perfect, terrible ecstasy that might last forever. Chapter 7. The galaxy burns. The moment when all 4 horrors converged was not marked by fanfare or cosmic announcement, but by the simple and terrible realization that reality itself had become uninhabitable. What had begun as separate manifestations of divine malice now intertwined with such intimate cruelty that they created new forms of suffering that had no names in any mortal language. The galaxy burned not with fire, but with the heat of pure impossibility made manifest. On the forge world of Lucius, where Khorne's crimson hour had first turned weapons against their wielders, the bloodshed began to feed something far worse than mere defeat. Each death carried with it such exquisite aesthetic perfection that the act of ending became transcendently beautiful. Tech adepts who had managed to resist the perfect excess found themselves overwhelmed as violence itself became an art form too sublime to resist. Brother Sergeant Malachar of the Iron Hands watched his chains ward carve through the neck of his battle brother and felt his consciousness explode with sensory overload. The spray of blood created patterns of mathematical perfection against the forge's adamantine walls. The sound of ceramite parting under blessed metal produced harmonics that made the greatest symphonies seem like crude noise. Even the dying brother's final breath carried notes of such tragic beauty that ending it seemed like both violence and mercy. "I cannot stop," Malachar whispered as his blade sought another target. "It is too beautiful to stop." The feedback loop between Khorne's hunger and Slanesh's excess created a new form of madness that consumed entire regiments. Violence became performance art. Defeat transformed into aesthetic expression. Warriors who had once fought for duty now killed for the pure pleasure of watching life become death in increasingly elaborate displays. The Vostroyan firstborn 12th Regiment, which had somehow survived their weapon's initial betrayal, found themselves choreographing devastation that would have made demon princes weep with envy. Each bayonet thrust was positioned to create maximum visual impact. Each lass bolt was fired to produce the most melodious death cry. The battlefield became a canvas painted in blood and screaming, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension and terrible beyond divine mercy. Yet even these horrors paled before what occurred when Tzeentch's reality manipulation encountered Nurgle's spiritual plague. On the hive world of Vervenhive, where the final rot had already consumed hope itself, the architect of fate began rewriting the past to make despair retroactively eternal. Inhabitants found themselves remembering childhoods that had never contained joy, histories where suffering was the only constant, futures where death was preferable to continued existence. Tech Dominus Castaigne of the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to analyze the temporal distortions and found his data corrupted not by mechanical failure, but by existential impossibility. His instruments showed him equations where mathematics itself had given up, algorithms that calculated the precise value of meaninglessness, data streams that proved beyond doubt that reality was a practical joke played by cruel gods. The numbers show that hope was always an illusion, he reported to his subordinates, his voice carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. We have the data to prove that suffering is the only universal constant. The Omnissiah's truth is that there is no truth. The combination of temporal manipulation and spiritual plague created zones where despair existed in past, present, and future simultaneously. Citizens experienced the weight of infinite lifetimes of meaninglessness compressed into single moments. Children aged to death, remembering sorrows they would never experience. The elderly grew young again, only to suffer through extended decades of pointless existence. In the segmentum tempestus, where all four influences converged with devastating completeness, entirely new forms of horror began to manifest. The death world of Katashan experienced the impossible phenomenon of beautiful despair, a form of suffering so aesthetically perfect that the planet's deadliest predators stopped hunting to contemplate the sublime meaninglessness of their own existence. Katachan devil squads found themselves unable to function as warriors because combat had become simultaneously too beautiful to interrupt and too pointless to pursue. Sergeant Harker watched a barking toad's poison take effect on one of his men and felt his consciousness split between aesthetic rapture at the death's visual perfection and existential horror at the futility of trying to prevent it. "The jungle wants us dead," he told his remaining squad, "but it also wants us to appreciate how beautifully it ends us, and it wants us to know that our deaths won't matter, and it wants time to flow backward so we can die again differently." The men under his command nodded with understanding that transcended sanity. They were experiencing a form of suffering that combined the worst elements of each chaos god's gift: violence made beautiful, reality made fluid, hope made impossible, and sensation made overwhelming. Across entire sectors, the warp began wounded through into real space with such intensity that the distinction between material and immaterial became academic. The eye of terror, which had contained chaos for 10 millennia, suddenly seemed quaint compared to the tears in reality that opened everywhere the four influences converged. On the shrine world of Hagia, where the Adepta Sororitas had maintained faith for centuries, the Cathedral of St. Aspera became a gateway to impossibility. The sacred space where thousands had found spiritual strength transformed into a realm where prayer became pain, where faith became weapon, where hope became the cruelest torment of all. Canoness Morwen, who had once found strength in the Emperor's love, now discovered that her devotion had become a form of existential agony. Each prayer was simultaneously an act of transcendent beauty, a weapon that brought her down, sisters, a lie that time kept rewriting, and a source of despair so profound that it made suicide seem optimistic. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, and the words became bullets that carved through her battle sister's armor. "His love endures," she continued, and reality rewrote itself to show that his love had never existed. "We are his angels," she concluded, and the beauty of her faith became so intense that her sisters collapsed in sensory overload while losing all will to live. The great imperial response machine that had governed humanity for 10 millennia simply ceased to function. Not because its operators were dead, but because the concept of organized resistance had become philosophically impossible. How could one fight an enemy when violence fed that enemy's allies? How could one plan strategy when the past kept changing? How could one maintain hope when despair was mathematically provable? How could one remain focused when existence itself was too beautiful to ignore? Lord Commander Solar Vespasian found himself in the unique position of commanding forces that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, fought with weapons that killed their wielders for aesthetic reasons, defended populations that had lost the will to be defended, and served an emperor whose protection had become a form of exquisite torment. "Issue the order to," he began, then stopped. What order could possibly make sense? "Retreat from..." He tried again, but retreat was impossible when space itself was unstable. "Hold positions until..." he attempted finally. But time was no longer linear enough for "until" to have meaning. His staff waited patiently for instructions that could never come, each officer lost in appreciation for the beautiful impossibility of their situation, while simultaneously despairing at its meaninglessness and feeling their weapons' hunger for their own blood. Yet in the depths of this convergent horror, something unexpected began to emerge. On worlds where all four influences pressed down with maximum force, some souls discovered that suffering could be transmuted into strength through pure will. Not the strength to resist the horror, but the strength to exist within it without being consumed. Captain Thaddeus of the Angels Exemplar, whose fortress monastery had become a charnel house of fratricidal beauty, found himself standing in the ruins of his chapel and feeling something he had never experienced before. A peace that transcended understanding. The convergence of all four horrors had pushed him beyond the limits of mortal endurance and into a state where suffering became irrelevant. "I am dead," he announced to his surviving battle brothers, "but I continue to serve. I am in agony, but I am also at peace. I am witnessing impossible beauty while knowing it means nothing, and I find this acceptable." His words carried a power that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. The battle brothers who heard him felt something shift in their consciousness, not relief from their suffering, but acceptance of it. They continued to experience all four horrors simultaneously, but the horrors no longer controlled them. Similar transcendent moments flickered across the galaxy, like stars being born in darkness. Certain inquisitors discovered that absolute knowledge of futility could become a form of liberation. Some tech adepts found that understanding meaninglessness was itself a kind of meaning. A handful of guardsmen learned that when everything became impossible, impossibility itself became a tool. These were not victories in any conventional sense. The horror continued unabated. Reality remained shattered. The Chaos Gods continued their convergent assault on existence itself, but scattered across the burning galaxy, isolated sparks of transcendent purpose began to flicker. Souls who had found a way to exist beyond suffering without escaping it. The convergence had reached its zenith. Four gods had combined their ultimate gifts to create a form of existence so terrible that it transcended horror and became something else entirely. The galaxy burned with fires that consumed meaning itself, and in that burning, the first hints of something beyond despair began to emerge. The warp bled through reality, like acid through parchment. Time flowed in all directions simultaneously. Hope and despair became indistinguishable. Beauty and horror merged into a single, overwhelming sensation that made existence itself a form of prayer to dark gods who laughed at their own success. Yet still, in scattered pockets across the stars, souls who had been pushed beyond the breaking point discovered that breaking could be survived. The convergence had created something worse than hell, but it had also revealed that some forms of transcendence could only be reached by passing through hell's deepest depths. The galaxy burned, but in its burning, something new was being forged. Chapter 8. The Last Faithful. In the darkest hour of the galaxy's torment, when reality itself had become uninhabitable, and hope seemed like a memory from a more innocent age, scattered across the stars like dying embers in an endless night, the last bastions of resistance began to shine with a light that no darkness could extinguish. These were not victories in any conventional sense, for victory itself had become meaningless in a universe where the rules of existence changed with each heartbeat. These were something far more precious. They were proof that the human spirit could endure even when humanity itself was being systematically destroyed. The Crimson Fist's chapter, Keep on Rin's World, had become a fortress of pure discipline in a galaxy where discipline itself was under assault. Chapter Master Pedro Cantor stood in the central command chamber, watching tactical displays that showed impossibilities as routine data. His battle brothers moved through the corridors with mechanical precision, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the chaos that pressed against their walls like a living thing. "Report," he commanded, his voice cutting through air thick with the psychic pressure of 4 gods pressing their attention upon his world. "Sir," replied Brother Sergeant Cortez, his scarred face showing no emotion despite the horrors he had witnessed. "The outer perimeter holds. 3rd Company reports no casualties in the last 6 hours." This was remarkable, not because the enemy was weak, but because the enemy was everything. Khorne's Crimson Hour had turned every weapon on the planet against its wielder, except those within the chapter keep. Slanesh's perfect excess had made existence itself intoxicating beyond endurance, except within these blessed walls. Tzeentch's rewriting had altered history, so that Rin's world had never been defended, except in the memories of those who stood guard now. Nurgle's final rot had convinced every soul on the planet that resistance was meaningless, except those who chose meaning over truth. "How?" Cantor asked, though he suspected the answer. "Discipline, sir," Cortez replied. "We follow the Codex. We maintain our posts. We serve the Emperor. Nothing else matters." The simplicity of it was staggering. While the galaxy burned around them, the Crimson Fists had saved themselves through the most fundamental of principles, doing their duty regardless of consequence. They did not fight the 4 horrors because they believed they could win. They fought because fighting was what Space Marines did. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, Canoness Superior Morwen had transformed her surviving battle sisters into something that transcended ordinary heroism. Where once they had been warriors of faith, they had become faith itself, given form and purpose. The Cathedral of St. Aspira, which had briefly become a gateway to impossible sensations, now stood as a bastion of spiritual purity that burned with light visible from orbit. "Sisters," Morwen addressed her charges, her voice carrying harmonics that cut through the psychic screaming of a tormented galaxy. "We are no longer fighting for the Imperium. The Imperium as we knew it is gone. We are no longer fighting for humanity. Humanity has been broken beyond recognition. We fight now for something simpler and infinitely more important. We fight because the Emperor loves us, and love is the only truth that cannot be rewritten, corrupted, or destroyed." Her words carried power because they were spoken without doubt, without reservation, without the complexity that had paralyzed so many others. Around her, 53 battle sisters knelt in perfect unison, their faith creating a bubble of sanity in a universe gone mad. The horrors pressed against their sanctuary like waves against a sea wall, but could not penetrate the simple certainty of souls who had chosen to believe regardless of evidence. Yet perhaps the most shocking development occurred in the cryogenic vaults beneath Macrage's fortress of Hera, where something unprecedented stirred within a stasis field that had remained unchanged for centuries. Robut Guilliman, the avenging son, had lain in healing sleep since the Battle of Thessala, his throat pierced by the anatheme blade that should have brought him down outright. The warp storms that ravaged the galaxy carried with them psychic energies of such intensity that they penetrated even the most secure vaults. The fourfold horror that consumed reality pressed against the stasis field with such force that it began to crack not the technology, but time itself around the Primarch's body. In a moment of impossible grace, the spiritual agony of his sons across the galaxy called to something deep within his genetic code. Guilliman's eyes opened. Chief Librarian Tigurius, who had maintained vigil over his gene father's tomb through sheer force of will, watched in stunned amazement as the Primarch's wounds began to heal not through medical intervention, but through pure spiritual determination. "My son," Guilliman spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of dreams and nightmares. "What has become of my father's realm?" "Lord," Tigurius replied, falling to one knee, "it burns. Everything burns. But some still fight." The Primarch rose from his sarcophagus like a force of nature given human form. Around him, the psychic pressure that had driven entire worlds mad seemed to recoil from something it could not corrupt or destroy. Within hours, he had assembled every functional ship in the Ultramar system and begun a crusade toward Terra that defied every tactical analysis of possibility. "We make for the throne world," he declared to his fleet commanders. "If my father still lives, he will need us. If he has fallen, we will ensure his sacrifice was not meaningless." The fleet that departed Ultramar was not large by the standards of the Great Crusade, but it carried something that had become rarer than archaeotech in the current galaxy: absolute purpose, unmarked by doubt, despair, or the seductive beauty of futility. Meanwhile, on Terra itself, the Adeptus Custodes had formed a defensive ring around the Golden Throne that had become the last absolute truth in a galaxy of relatives. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood in the throne room's antechamber, watching his guardians maintain positions they had held for hours without relief, without rest, without acknowledging the impossibilities that pressed against the palace walls. "The outer palace has fallen to unreality," reported Shield Captain Tyvar, his voice betraying no emotion despite reporting the collapse of structures that had stood since the Age of Strife. "The Middle Palace experiences temporal fluctuations. Only the inner sanctum remains stable." "Then we hold the inner sanctum," Valoris replied, with the calm of a man who had never considered any alternative. "The Emperor's will be done." The custodians around him nodded in unison, their transhuman physiques and psychological conditioning creating an island of stability in an ocean of chaos. They did not fight the four horrors because they believed they could defeat gods. They stood guard because standing guard was what they had been created to do, and creation's purpose could not be altered by circumstance. Across the galaxy, scattered inquisitors began attempting something that should have been impossible: coordination in a universe where communication itself had become unreliable. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Koteas, broadcasting from the fortress world of Kasser Partox, sent out astropathic messages that somehow retained their coherence despite the warp storms that had consumed normal communication. "To all servants of the throne who can hear this transmission," his words carried across the void with authority that commanded attention. "The situation is catastrophic, but not hopeless. Isolated bastions of resistance exist across all sectors. Maintain your positions. Trust in the Emperor's protection. We endure not because victory is certain, but because endurance is our duty." His message reached Sister Superior Miria on the cemetery world of Certus Minor, where her squad had held a shrine against horrors that defied description. It found Tech Dominus Zerath on Mars, where a handful of tech adepts maintained the sacred rituals despite their instruments, showing that reality itself had become incoherent. It touched the minds of Commissar Ibram Gaunt on Tanith, where his ghosts continued fighting an enemy that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. Each of these bastions existed in defiance of possibility. They should not have survived the convergence of four gods' ultimate malice. They should not have maintained coherence when reality itself had become unstable. They should not have continued fighting when fighting had lost all meaning. Yet they endured, not through strength of arms or superiority of tactics, but through something far simpler and infinitely more powerful, the recognition that some duties transcended circumstance. They fought not because they believed they could win, but because losing was unacceptable regardless of consequence. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's consciousness stirred for the first time in millennia with something approaching recognition. Across the galaxy, scattered sparks of absolute faith were calling to him, with voices that cut through the psychic screaming of tormented reality. His loyal sons and daughters still stood watch. His guardians still held their posts. His servants still served despite being offered every reason to surrender. For 10,000 years, he had sustained them with his will. Now, perhaps, it was time for them to sustain him with theirs. The last faithful had proven something that even the Chaos Gods had not anticipated, that faith freely given was stronger than any force that could be brought against it. Not the faith of the ignorant or the desperate, but the faith of those who understood exactly what they faced and chose to stand against it anyway. The Resistance arc had become the dominant narrative of the galaxy's story. Where once the four horrors had seemed unstoppable, now they faced something they had never encountered before, souls who could not be broken because they had already been broken and had chosen to continue anyway. The galaxy still burned, but in its burning, the last faithful had lit beacons that would guide something greater than themselves back to a universe that had almost forgotten what hope looked like. Chapter 9. The Emperor's Gambit. The moment came, not with fanfare or herald, but with a silence so profound that it seemed to hollow out the universe itself. For the first time in 10 millennia, the master of mankind stirred upon the golden throne, not as a dying god clinging to existence, but as a father whose children had called to him across the void with voices too pure to ignore. The psychic beacon that had guided humanity through its darkest age flickered, then began to fade, as the Emperor of mankind prepared to gamble everything on a single, impossible act of defiance against gods who thought themselves supreme. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt it first, a subtle shift in the throne room's atmosphere that made his transhuman senses scream warnings he had never experienced. The Emperor's form, withered and broken upon the life-sustaining throne, began to shimmer with energies that had not been seen since the Great Crusade. The machinery that had preserved his mortal shell for centuries groaned under forces it was never designed to contain. "My lord," Valoris whispered, though no words could encompass what was happening before him. The Emperor's eyes opened, not the dead sockets that had stared unseeing for millennia, but eyes that blazed with the light of newborn stars. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself ring like a struck bell. "My son," the Emperor said, each word carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated sorrow and rage, "I have watched, I have endured, I have sustained the light while my realm burned around me. But my children have proven something I had forgotten, that faith freely given is stronger than any force the universe can marshal against it. The Golden Throne began to crack, not the mechanical failures that tech adepts had fought for centuries, but fundamental fractures in the device's ability to contain what the Emperor was becoming. Across Terra, every psychically sensitive soul felt the moment when the master of mankind made his choice. The Astronomicon died. Across the galaxy, navigator houses screamed as their third eyes burned with the sudden absence of the psychic beacon that had guided their ships for 10 millennia. Warp travel became impossible in an instant, stranding millions of vessels in the void between stars. The great lighthouse of humanity's soul went dark, and in that darkness, something far more terrible and wonderful prepared to ignite. On Luna, where the Sisters of Silence maintained their eternal vigil, the psychic null suddenly felt their powers invert. Instead of dampening warp energies, they began to channel them with perfect clarity. Abbess Sanctorum. Jessie Tull fell to her knees as visions flooded her mind. Not the chaotic screaming of damaged psychers, but the crystalline certainty of divine purpose made manifest. "He rises," she whispered to her silent sisters, and for the first time in the Order's history, they heard her words not with their ears, but with souls that suddenly blazed with reflected glory. The Emperor's consciousness departed the Golden Throne like a storm given form and purpose. His psychic essence, accumulated across 10,000 years of worship and sustained by the faith of countless trillions, manifested simultaneously across 4 critical battlefields where his intervention was most desperately needed. On Lucius, where the Forge world burned with Khorne's beautiful violence, the Emperor appeared not as the golden god of imperial propaganda, but as a figure in simple robes whose presence made every weapon on the planet remember its true purpose. The chains wards that had hungered for their wielder's blood suddenly felt shame for their betrayal. Bolt pistols that had turned upon their masters found their machine spirits weeping for forgiveness. Brother Sergeant Malachar, who had been lost in the aesthetic perfection of defeat, looked up to see a man whose eyes held depths of compassion that made violence seem not just wrong, but pitifully small. Around him, his fellow iron hands slowly lowered weapons that no longer thirsted for fraternal blood. "My sons," the Emperor said, his voice cutting through Khorne's rage like light through shadow. "You were made for more than this. Your strength was meant to protect, not to destroy those you were sworn to defend." The Blood God's laughter, which had echoed across the Forge world for days, suddenly faltered. For the first time since his birth in the warp's depths, Khorne felt something he had never experienced. Disappointment from a father whose love he had never sought, but always craved. On Vervan Hive, where Tzeentch's temporal manipulations had made despair retroactively eternal, the Emperor manifested as a figure whose very presence stabilized causality itself. The past stopped rewriting itself when he walked among the broken inhabitants. Future and present snapped back into linear progression with an audible crack that echoed across the hive's countless levels. Tech Dominus Castaigne, whose instruments had shown him the mathematical certainty of meaninglessness, watched his data streams suddenly resolve into equations that proved the opposite, that hope was not just possible, but inevitable. The architect of fate's grand design unraveled in the presence of a mind too vast and certain to be deceived by possibility. "The future is not written by schemes," the Emperor declared, his words reaching every soul in the hive simultaneously, "but by choices made in love rather than fear." Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth shuddered as pathways of fate that had been locked in place for millennia suddenly opened to reveal new possibilities, futures where suffering was not inevitable, where change served growth rather than corruption, where wisdom was pursued for its own sake rather than for power over others. On Gehenna Prime, where Nurgle's final rot had convinced an entire world that existence was meaningless suffering, the Emperor appeared as a gardener, tending to withered soil with infinite patience. Where his footsteps fell, the spiritual plague began to retreat. Not cured, but revealed for what it truly was, a lie so profound that it could only survive in the absence of genuine love. The agri-serfs who had lost all hope felt something stir within them as the Emperor knelt to examine the body-starch crops that had fed billions. In his hands, the dead grain began to sprout with new life, not through miracle, but through the simple recognition that growth was possible even in the darkest soil. "My children," he said to the empty fields, knowing his words would reach every despairing heart across the planet. "You were never meant to carry this burden alone. Your suffering has not been meaningless. It has prepared you for joy you cannot yet imagine." Nurgle's garden of blessed decay writhed as the Plague Father felt something he had thought impossible: competition from a gardener whose love of growth was as strong as the god's love of entropy. On Laxin Quintus, where Slanesh's perfect excess had trapped billions in sensory overload, the Emperor manifested as a figure of such simple, genuine beauty that the artificial perfection around him was revealed as crude theatre. The reality that had become addictively intense suddenly seemed hollow by comparison to the profound peace that surrounded his presence. Lord Governor Marius Hax, who had stood transfixed before a crystal sculpture for days, found himself able to look away for the first time. Not because the sculpture had lost its beauty, but because he had encountered something more beautiful: the quiet dignity of existence experienced without the need for constant stimulation. True perfection, the Emperor said to the planet's trapped population, his words carrying across every enhanced sensation, is not intensity, but harmony. Not excess, but sufficiency. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but the recognition that life itself is the greatest gift. Slanesh's realm of impossible sensations cracked like glass as the Dark Prince encountered something that had never existed before: genuine contentment that required no enhancement to be complete. The psychic battle that followed threatened to tear reality apart at its most fundamental level. 4 gods who had ruled the warp since time immemorial suddenly found themselves confronted by a will that had been shaped by 10 millennia of worship, sacrifice, and the accumulated faith of a species that had never quite given up hope. But the cost of the Emperor's intervention became apparent almost immediately. The throne fails," he reported to the High Lords, his augmetic voice carrying harmonics of despair that his organic components would never have allowed. "Without the Emperor's presence, we have perhaps hours before total systemic collapse." Yet even as terror began its death throes, the Emperor's simultaneous manifestation across 4 battlefields was achieving something unprecedented. For the first time since their birth, the 4 Chaos gods were being forced to retreat, not because they had been defeated, but because they had been outmatched in the very spheres they claimed to rule absolutely. Khorne's rage was countered by disciplined purpose. Tzeentch's scheming was overwhelmed by honest intention. Nurgle's despair was dispelled by genuine compassion. Slanesh's excess was rendered meaningless by authentic contentment. The psychic shockwaves of this cosmic confrontation rippled across the galaxy like tsunamis of pure meaning. On worlds that had been consumed by the 4-fold horror, populations began to remember why they had fought, why they had hoped, why they had loved. The hybrid abominations that had emerged from the convergence of divine malice began to dissolve as their component influences separated and retreated. But victory came at a price that would reshape the very nature of the Imperium. The Emperor's gambit was succeeding, but the cost was becoming clear. The master of mankind had traded his eternal vigil for a single moment of direct intervention. Terra was dying, the Astronomicon was gone, and the great beacon that had held humanity together for 10,000 years was guttering like a candle in a hurricane. In the depths of the warp, 4 gods who had thought themselves supreme felt something they had never experienced before: doubt. Not about their own power, but about whether power itself was the highest truth in the universe. The Emperor had shown them something that transcended their understanding. The possibility that love was stronger than fear, that hope was more durable than despair, that simple human dignity was more beautiful than any excess they could devise. The galactic battle between gods and mortals had reached its climax, and the outcome remained balanced on a knife's edge that could cut either way. Chapter 10. The Shattered Equilibrium. The moment of victory was marked not by celebration, but by a silence so profound that it seemed to echo through dimensions that had no names. Across the galaxy, the fourfold horror began its retreat like a tide, pulling back from shores it had devastated beyond recognition. Yet what remained in the wake of divine intervention was a universe so fundamentally altered that those who witnessed it would spend lifetimes learning to inhabit a reality that no longer followed the rules they had once understood. On Lucius, Brother Sergeant Malachar of the Iron Hands knelt among the bodies of battle brothers whose weapons had turned against them in the name of beautiful violence. The chain swords and bolt pistols that had betrayed their wielders now lay silent, their machine spirits weeping electric tears of shame. The Forge World's great manufactorums had fallen silent, not from destruction, but from a kind of mechanical grief that had infected every blessed weapon on the planet. "The Emperor came to us," Malachar reported to the few surviving officers, his voice carrying harmonics of wonder that his augmetic throat had never been designed to produce. I felt his presence, and for a moment everything made sense. But now, he gestured to the twisted metal that had once been weapons of war. Where the Emperor's manifestation had touched reality, the very concept of violence had been altered. Weapons could still function, but they would never again forget their true purpose. Every blade would remember the weight of betrayal. Every trigger would carry the memory of turning against those it was meant to defend. The scars were permanent. Across the Forge World's surface, zones of altered reality marked where the divine intervention had occurred. In these areas, the fundamental nature of conflict had changed. Violence was still possible, but it carried with it an awareness of consequence that made casual cruelty impossible to sustain. On Terra, the cost of victory was becoming catastrophically clear. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood in the throne room and watched the Golden Throne complete its final collapse. The mechanism that had sustained both Emperor and Imperium for 10 millennia cracked with sounds like breaking continents, its failing systems casting shadows that seemed to reach into dimensions beyond mortal perception. "Sir," reported Shield Captain Tyvar, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure while witnessing the end of an age, "the webway barriers have collapsed completely. Demonic incursions are being reported across 17 palace sectors. The palace defenses are holding, but barely." The Emperor's physical form, which had withered upon the throne for centuries, was dissolving into motes of golden light that drifted through the chamber, like funeral pyres made of stars. His consciousness spread across 4 battlefields in a desperate gambit to save his species, was slowly returning to a body that could no longer contain it. Fabricator General Kane's augmetic sensors recorded data that defied all understanding. The Emperor was dying, but his death was unlike anything in recorded history. Rather than simply failing, his essence was dispersing into the warp itself, becoming something that existed between life and death, between mortal and divine, between presence and absence. "The readings are impossible," Kane reported to the assembled High Lords, his mechanical voice struggling to process data that challenged the fundamental nature of existence itself. "The Emperor lives, but not as we understand life. He is dying, but his death is creating something new. The distinction between material and immaterial is breaking down around his presence." In the depths of the palace, where tech adepts had maintained sacred rituals for generations, the machinery that had channeled the Emperor's will began to transform, not breaking down, but evolving into something that no human science could comprehend. The technology itself was becoming partially alive, partially divine, partially impossible. Across the galaxy, surviving Imperial forces attempted to restore order to a cosmos that had been fundamentally altered. On Vervun Hive, where Tzeentch's temporal manipulations had made history fluid, Tech Dominus Casten found himself trying to coordinate with subordinates who existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. Some remembered the horror that had consumed their world. Others recalled only the Emperor's intervention. A few existed in both states at once, their consciousness split between despair and hope in ways that should have driven them mad, but somehow didn't. "Send word to all remaining Imperial forces," Castaigne transmitted across compromised Vox networks, his message reaching audiences in past, present, and future simultaneously. "The immediate threat has passed, but we are operating in unknown territory. All previous protocols are suspended. Trust your faith, not your instruments." His words carried weight because they acknowledged what everyone could feel, but few dared to voice, that victory had transformed them as much as defeat would have. The galaxy they had fought to save no longer existed. In its place was something that bore the same name, but operated according to principles that no human mind had been prepared to understand. On Gehenna Prime, where Nurgle's final rot had convinced populations that existence was meaningless suffering, the Agri serfs who had lost all hope found themselves in a world where despair was no longer inevitable, but still remained possible. The spiritual plague had retreated, but it had left behind a kind of existential scar tissue that would forever mark those who had experienced absolute meaninglessness. Planetary Governor Vex, who had presided over a world's descent into spiritual death, now faced the impossible task of governing a population that had been fundamentally altered by their encounter with divine intervention. Some citizens remembered only the plague. Others recalled only the cure. Many existed in a state where they understood both the reality of suffering and the possibility of transcendence. "Issue emergency rations to all sectors," he ordered his staff, though the words felt inadequate to the task at hand. "Begin reconstruction of essential services, and prepare counseling services for those who remember things that may or may not have happened." The practical challenges of governing reality that had become negotiable were beginning to reveal themselves. How could one enforce laws when the past itself had been proven mutable? How could one plan for a future when causality had been demonstrated to be optional? How could one maintain order when the fundamental nature of existence had been revealed to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined? In the depths of the warp, the 4 Chaos gods retreated to lick wounds that cut deeper than mere defeat. Khorne, whose rage had been met with disciplined purpose, found himself questioning whether strength truly came from anger or from something more controlled and directed. Tzeentch, whose schemes had been outmaneuvered by honest intention, began to wonder if there were forms of change that his manipulations could never achieve. Nurgle, whose despair had been dispelled by genuine compassion, felt something he had never experienced before, the possibility that growth might be more powerful than decay. Slaanesh, whose excess had been rendered meaningless by authentic contentment, discovered that there were forms of beauty that required no enhancement to achieve perfection. Their retreat was not a surrender, but a recognition that they had encountered something they did not understand. The Emperor's intervention had proven that there were forces in the universe that operated according to principles beyond their comprehension. For the first time since their birth, the Chaos Gods felt genuinely challenged, not by superior power, but by superior purpose. The rivalry between them, which had sustained the great game for millennia, now burned with new intensity. Each sought to understand how mortal virtues had proven stronger than divine corruption. Each began developing new strategies that acknowledged the existence of forces they had never before considered relevant to their domains. Yet their retreat had consequences that rippled across reality itself. Where the four influences had converged most completely, permanent warp storms now marked regions where the barriers between material and immaterial had been irreparably damaged. The Eye of Terror, which had once seemed like the galaxy's greatest wound, now appeared almost quaint compared to the scars left by divine intervention on such a massive scale. Navigator houses reported that entire sectors had become permanently inaccessible, not because they were destroyed, but because they existed in states that defied conventional travel. Some regions experienced time at different rates. Others existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. A few had become places where thought and reality interacted so directly that unprotected minds could reshape existence simply by believing strongly enough. Robot Guilliman, leading his desperate crusade from Ultramar toward Terra, found himself navigating a galaxy that had been transformed in ways that made the Great Rift seem like a minor navigational hazard. His fleet's progress was slowed not by enemy action, but by the need to constantly recalibrate their understanding of what was possible. "My lord," reported Chief Librarian Tigurius, his psychic senses struggling to process readings that challenged his training. "We are approaching a region where causality appears to be optional. Our charts show 3 different routes to Terra, all of which may exist simultaneously." Guilliman studied tactical displays that showed impossible geometries with the same methodical approach he had once applied to more conventional strategic problems. "Then we take all 3 routes simultaneously. If reality has become negotiable, we negotiate." The Primarch's response exemplified what was becoming necessary across the galaxy: the recognition that survival in the post-intervention universe would require entirely new ways of thinking. Victory against the Chaos Gods had been achieved, but the cost was becoming clear. Humanity would need to evolve beyond its current understanding of existence itself. The immediate crisis was ending, but in its wake lay challenges that might prove even more difficult to overcome. How could a species learn to live in a universe where the fundamental rules of reality were no longer guaranteed? How could an Imperium function when the very concepts of space and time had been proven mutable? The Emperor's gambit had succeeded, but success had transformed the very nature of the game being played. The galaxy that emerged from the fourfold horror was one where transcendence was possible but not guaranteed, where divine intervention had proven both salvation and transformation, where victory carried costs that might take millennia to fully understand. The equilibrium between order and chaos had been shattered, and from its ruins, something entirely new would need to be built. Chapter 11. The New Dark Age. 10 years had passed since the Emperor's Gambit had saved the galaxy from the fourfold horror, and in that decade, humanity had learned that survival in a transformed universe required entirely new ways of existing. The Imperium that emerged from the ashes of divine intervention bore little resemblance to the monolithic empire that had ruled for 10 millennia. In its place had grown something more fragmented, more adaptive, and infinitely more strange, a collection of isolated regions that had each developed their own methods of existing in a reality where the fundamental laws of existence could no longer be taken for granted. The segmentum solar, once the beating heart of imperial civilization, had become an archipelago of functioning worlds separated by vast regions where space itself remained unreliable. Lord Commander Solar Vespasian, governing from the moon of Luna, since Terra's transformation had made the homeworld uninhabitable for normal human life, presided over a realm that existed in a constant state of improvisation. "Report on the Proxima system," he requested during the morning briefing, though morning itself had become a negotiable concept when time flowed differently across various sectors. "Sir," replied Admiral Quintanus, consulting data slates that showed readings in multiple temporal dimensions. "The system is stable, but it exists approximately 3 days ahead of our current time stream. Trade convoys report successful deliveries, but they arrive before they depart." Such impossibilities had become routine administrative challenges. The bureaucracy that had once managed galactic governance through standardized procedures now operated like a collection of diplomatic missions to foreign realities. Each world required unique protocols, specialized equipment, and personnel trained to function in conditions that defied conventional physics. In the former Eastern Fringe, where the Emperor's intervention had left particularly deep scars on reality, entirely new forms of human civilization had begun to emerge. On the agricultural world of Xerion Prime, planetary governor Miras Den had overseen the development of farming techniques that acknowledged the mutable nature of existence itself. "The crops grow in yesterday's soil but ripen in tomorrow's sunlight," she explained to visiting administrators from more stable regions. "We plant according to emotional seasons rather than temporal ones. Hope makes the grain flourish. Despair causes it to wither regardless of water or nutrients." Her farmers had become part agronomist, part philosopher, part therapist. They tended fields that responded as much to psychological states as to traditional agricultural science. The food they produced sustained not just bodies, but spirits, creating surpluses of both nutrition and morale that had made Xerion Prime a beacon of stability in an otherwise chaotic region. Across the galaxy, new religious movements had arisen to interpret the events that had shattered the old order. The most prominent was the Tetrahedron doctrine, founded by a former ecclesiarchy priest named Cardinal Matthias Vex, who preached that the fourfold horror had been a divine test that humanity had passed through the Emperor's sacrifice. "We witnessed the 4 faces of spiritual death," Vex proclaimed from the pulpit of his makeshift cathedral on the hive world of Necromunda. His words broadcast across Vox networks that reached dozens of worlds. "Korn showed us the death of purpose through mindless violence. Tzeentch revealed the death of truth through endless change. Nurgle demonstrated the death of hope through universal despair. Slaanesh exhibited the death of meaning through overwhelming sensation. His doctrine held that each human soul now carried within it the potential for both transcendence and corruption, and that constant vigilance was required to choose correctly at each moment. Tetrahedron temples featured 4 altars arranged in a square, each representing one of the defeated horrors, with the faithful required to acknowledge the temptation of each before approaching the central shrine dedicated to the Emperor's sacrifice. "We are no longer innocent," the cardinal taught his growing congregation. "We have seen what lies beyond the veil, and we can never unknow it. But knowledge of darkness makes light more precious, not less." The movement spread rapidly among survivors who had experienced the convergence directly. Unlike the traditional imperial cult, which emphasized humanity's weakness and need for protection, the tetrahedron doctrine taught that humans had been tested by gods and found worthy of survival through their own choices rather than divine mercy. In the isolated communities scattered across worlds that had been transformed by the intervention, practical rituals had developed to ward against the lingering effects of divine malice. On the forge world of Lucius, where weapons still carried memories of betrayal, the surviving Iron Hands had instituted daily ceremonies of recommitment between warrior and armament. Brother Sergeant Malachar, now elevated to captain following the losses his chapter had sustained, led his remaining battle brothers in rituals that would have seemed bizarre to their predecessors. Each morning, every Space Marine formally apologized to his weapons for the moment when divine corruption had turned them against their wielders. Each evening, they offered thanks for the tool's return to loyalty. "We cannot pretend that the betrayal never happened," Malachar explained to a delegation from the Ultramarines who had come seeking guidance for their own reformed practices. "Our weapons remember turning against us, and we remember being turned upon. But acknowledgement of that wound allows healing that denial would prevent." Similar practices had emerged across every world that had experienced direct divine intervention. Reality itself had been traumatized, and recovery required recognizing that trauma rather than attempting to restore conditions that could no longer exist. Perhaps most significantly, the collapse of Central Imperial authority had created opportunities for Xenos races that had been driven into hiding during humanity's age of expansion. The Tau Empire, which had seen its technology devolve during Zentish's reality manipulation, had recovered with innovations that incorporated the lessons of temporal instability into their designs. Commander Shadowsun, leading the reformed Fourth Sphere expansion, had developed tactics that assumed reality might change during battle. Her forces carried equipment designed to function regardless of whether the laws of physics remained constant. Her strategies incorporated the possibility that victory conditions might alter mid-conflict. "The humans taught us that survival requires adaptation to impossibility," she reported to the Ethereal Council from the recently reclaimed world of Daleth. "We expand not to conquer fixed territory, but to create zones of stability that can endure regardless of what reality becomes." The Eldar, whose prophecies had been shattered by the intervention, had retreated even further from galactic affairs. But some far-seers had begun developing new methods of divination that acknowledged the mutable nature of fate itself. Rather than trying to predict fixed futures, they worked to identify the underlying principles that remained constant even when surface reality shifted. "We cannot see what will happen," explained Fasir Iyanna Arianal of Craftworld Iyandan, "but we can perceive what will remain true regardless of what happens. Love endures change. Courage transcends circumstances. Purpose survives transformation." The Space Marine chapters, deprived of central coordination and scattered across a galaxy where travel had become uncertain, had transformed from garrison forces into wandering crusaders. The Imperial Fists, whose fortress monastery had been destroyed during the convergence, now operated from a mobile fleet that carried their traditions between worlds that needed their strength. Chapter Master Darnath. Lysander had embraced this nomadic existence as a return to the Great Crusade's original purpose. "We bring not just military might," he declared to his battle brothers, as their strike cruiser emerged from warp transit near a system requesting aid, but proof that the Emperor's vision survives transformation. We are living relics of an age that ended, carrying its best principles into whatever age begins. His fists, specialized in helping isolated communities, develop defenses against the lingering effects of divine corruption. They taught fortress-building techniques that incorporated psychological as well as physical barriers. They trained local defenders in combat doctrines that assumed reality might shift during battle. Most importantly, they demonstrated through their presence that connection to something larger than local circumstances remained possible. The Blood Angels had developed similar practices, though their wandering crusades focused on worlds where the spiritual wounds left by the convergence had created populations vulnerable to despair or rage. Captain Dante, now elevated to chapter master, following losses sustained during the intervention, led his battle brothers in what they called sanguinary missions, deployments designed to heal communities rather than simply defend them. "We carry the red thirst," Dante explained to planetary governors who requested their aid. "But we have learned to transform thirst into service. We know what it means to struggle against corruption from within. This knowledge makes us suited to help others wage similar battles." The galaxy that emerged from the new Dark Age bore little resemblance to the Imperium that had existed before the fourfold horror. Central authority had given way to regional autonomy. Rigid doctrine had been replaced by adaptive practices. The certainty of imperial truth had been supplemented by acknowledgement that truth itself might take forms that previous ages hadn't anticipated. Yet perhaps most remarkably, this fragmented galaxy showed signs of being more resilient than the monolithic empire it had replaced. When reality remained uncertain, diversity of approach became a survival advantage. When central authority could not function, local initiative became essential. When traditional methods failed, innovation became mandatory. The new Dark Age was darker in the sense that innocence had been lost forever. Humanity could no longer pretend that existence was stable, that authority was permanent, that protection was guaranteed. But it was also an age of greater awareness, deeper purpose, and more genuine hope than many previous eras had achieved. Across 1,000 worlds, survivors who had faced the absolute worst that divine malice could devise had chosen to continue. They built new homes in the wreckage of the old. They developed new customs to address unprecedented challenges. They formed new communities based on shared understanding rather than imposed authority. The galaxy had learned that survival was possible even when survival seemed impossible. This knowledge, purchased at a price almost too terrible to calculate, had become the foundation for whatever civilization would emerge from the ruins of what had come before. Chapter 12. The Price of Salvation. 10 years had passed since the galaxy had learned the true cost of victory against gods, and in those years, humanity had come to understand that some prices are not paid once, but continue to accumulate interest across generations. The fourfold horror had been defeated, the immediate threat had receded, and life had found ways to continue even in a universe where the fundamental rules of existence could no longer be trusted. Yet the question that haunted every survivor, from the highest lords to the humblest citizens, was whether what they had saved was still worth the price they had paid to save it. The Imperium that emerged from the ashes of divine intervention was unrecognizable to those who remembered the age that had ended. Where once a single will had governed 1,000,000 worlds through the strength of absolute authority, now 1,000 different experiments in survival competed for relevance in a galaxy that had become negotiable. The loss was immeasurable. The unity, the certainty, the simple faith that had sustained humanity through 10,000 years of darkness had been shattered as completely as any weapon turned against its wielder. Yet what remained was perhaps more precious for being more fragile. In the isolated regions that had learned to govern themselves, new forms of human dignity had emerged, communities that chose their own paths rather than following imposed doctrine, leaders who earned authority through service rather than inheriting it through station. Faith that had been tested by direct encounter with the alternatives and had chosen to endure not from ignorance, but from knowledge of what the absence of faith truly meant. On Terra, where the Golden Throne had completed its final transformation into something that existed between technology and miracle, the Emperor's presence had become both more and less than it had been during the long centuries of his entombment. Custodian Captain General Valoris, now the guardian of mysteries that no human mind had been designed to comprehend, maintained vigil over a being who existed simultaneously in past, present, future, and dimensions that had no names in any mortal language. "He speaks," Valoris reported to the handful of High Lords who could still function in Terra's transformed reality. But his words arrive before he speaks them, and their meaning changes based on who hears them. Yesterday, he warned me of a threat that will emerge in 3 centuries. This morning, he thanked me for service I have not yet rendered. Yet somehow, each message is exactly what its recipient needs to hear at the moment they hear it. The Emperor's sacrifice had preserved humanity, but at the cost of his existence in any form that humanity could fully understand. He had become something that transcended the categories of living and dead, present and absent, divine and mortal. His guidance remained available to those who needed it, but only to those who had learned to interpret truth that came wrapped in impossibility. The practical implications rippled through every aspect of imperial civilization. The administratum, which had once operated through standardized procedures applied uniformly across the galaxy, now functioned more like a diplomatic corps, negotiating with realities that followed different rules. The ecclesiarchy had split into dozens of denominations, each interpreting the Emperor's transformation according to their own understanding of what divinity meant in an age when gods had proven to be as vulnerable as mortals. The Adeptus Mechanicus had undergone perhaps the most radical transformation of all. The rigid doctrine of the Omnissiah had given way to a more fluid understanding that acknowledged the machine spirits themselves had been traumatized by the events they had witnessed. Tech adepts now spent as much time counseling their equipment as maintaining it, developing therapeutic rituals for servo skulls that had developed anxiety and maintenance ceremonies for cogitators that had begun to dream. "The machines remember," explained Fabricator General Kane during his final report before retiring to a life of pure research. "And their memories are not always benevolent. We learned that technology is not merely tool, but partner, and partners must be healed together or not at all." The Space Marine chapters had embraced their new role as wandering protectors with varying degrees of success. Some had thrived in the freedom to pursue their founding purposes without bureaucratic oversight. The Imperial Fists had become master builders, not just of fortifications, but of communities, teaching isolated populations how to construct defenses against spiritual as well as physical threats. The Blood Angels had developed techniques for channeling genetic flaws into strengths, transforming the red thirst into an empathic connection that allowed them to sense and heal psychological wounds in others. But other chapters had struggled with the loss of central purpose. Without clear enemies to fight or explicit orders to follow, some had descended into internal conflicts or ritualistic obsessions. The galaxy's new diversity had produced both remarkable innovations and tragic failures, often within the same communities. Perhaps most significantly, the relationship between humanity and the Xenos races had begun to shift in ways that previous ages would have found unthinkable. The shared experience of surviving reality's breakdown had created a kind of mutual recognition among species that had once viewed each other as existential threats. Trade agreements now included provisions for temporal displacement. Diplomatic protocols acknowledged that some negotiations might need to be conducted across multiple timelines simultaneously. Commander Shadowsun's reformed Tau Empire had become an unexpected source of stability in the Eastern Fringe, their adaptive technology proving invaluable to human colonies struggling with reality fluctuations. In exchange for technical assistance, they had gained access to human philosophical traditions that had proven more durable than Tau material science during the Convergence crisis. The humans taught us that some truths transcend logic, Shadowsun reported to the Ethereal Council, her words carrying weight that would have been impossible before her species had witnessed the impossible. We believed that progress meant moving beyond such concepts. We have learned that progress sometimes means moving toward them. Even the Eldar, traditionally the most isolated of the galaxy's sapient species, had begun to emerge from their craft worlds with offers of assistance that would have been unthinkable in previous eras. Their experience with prophecy and fate had proven invaluable to communities struggling to navigate reality, where cause and effect had become optional. Yet, in the depths of the warp, the four Chaos Gods had not simply retreated to lick their wounds. Their defeat by the Emperor's intervention had taught them something that 10,000 years of rivalry hadn't. That there were forces in the universe they did not understand, and understanding those forces had become their new obsession. Khorne had begun experimenting with forms of conflict that transcended simple violence. His latest champions fought battles of purpose rather than rage, seeking to prove the superiority of their causes through demonstration rather than domination. The Blood God was learning that victory meant more than the accumulation of skulls. Tzeentch had discovered that some changes were more profound than the manipulation of surface reality. The Architect of Fate now worked to understand transformation that occurred at levels deeper than the merely physical or temporal. His schemes had become attempts to comprehend rather than control the forces that had proven superior to his manipulations. Nurgle had encountered the possibility that decay might not be the ultimate fate of all things. The Plague Father was experimenting with forms of entropy that included renewal, cycles that incorporated growth as well as decline. His garden was becoming something that previous ages of his existence would not have recognized. Slaanesh had been forced to acknowledge that some forms of perfection could not be enhanced through excess. The Dark Prince was exploring sensations that required restraint to achieve their full intensity, pleasures that could only be experienced by those who had learned to appreciate simplicity. The four gods were evolving, and their evolution carried implications that even the most far-sighted human strategists could not fully anticipate. The great game was becoming something more complex, more subtle, and potentially more dangerous than the crude contest for dominance that had characterized their previous relationship. The lesson that emerged from 10 years of living with the consequences of divine intervention was both simple and devastating. Victory against chaos was possible, but it always came at a cost so severe that victory and defeat became difficult to distinguish. Humanity had been saved, but the humanity that survived was something new, strange, and uncertain of its own nature. In the scattered archives where scholars attempted to record the meaning of what had occurred, a consensus had begun to emerge around what would come to be known as the doctrine of necessary loss, the recognition that preserving what mattered most sometimes required sacrificing everything else, and that wisdom lay in choosing what to lose, rather than pretending that loss could be avoided. The galaxy had learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary crisis. Communities that had once derived their strength from knowing their place in a vast, stable order now found meaning in their ability to adapt to conditions that changed without warning. Faith that had once been based on the promise of eternal protection now rested on the demonstrated ability to endure when protection failed. Children born in the decade following the convergence grew up in a universe where impossible things happened regularly, where adults acknowledged that they did not understand how reality worked, where the greatest wisdom was admitting the limits of one's knowledge. These children would become the first generation of truly post-intervention humans, and what they would build from the wreckage of certainty remained to be seen. The price of salvation had been the loss of innocence on a galactic scale. Humanity could no longer pretend that existence was safe, that authority was permanent, that the universe was comprehensible. But in exchange for that innocence, they had gained something that might prove more valuable: the knowledge that meaning could survive meaninglessness, that love could transcend fear, that hope was possible even when hope seemed absurd. As the second decade after the convergence began, the galaxy faced its future with eyes wide open to both possibility and peril. The Chaos Gods were evolving new strategies. Reality remained fundamentally unstable. The challenges ahead might prove even more difficult than those that had been overcome. Yet across 1,000,000 worlds, beings who had faced the worst that divine malice could devise continued to choose growth over decay, truth over deception, love over indifference, hope over despair. Not because these choices were easy or safe or guaranteed to succeed, but because they had learned that the act of choosing itself was what separated existence from mere survival. The war against chaos had not ended with the Emperor's gambit. It had simply entered a new phase, one where the battleground was no longer territory or resources, but the fundamental question of what it meant to be conscious in a universe where consciousness itself was under constant assault. Whether humanity would prove worthy of the salvation that had been purchased at such terrible cost remained to be written in the choices yet to be made. Those who oppose necessary change will find themselves isolated and powerless. Guilliman bowed his head, accepting the burden of governance that would define the remainder of his existence. It was not the crusade of liberation he might have preferred, but it was the patient work of civilization, building better tomorrows one careful decision at a time. To those who declared me false or demon corrupted, the Emperor said, his voice carrying forgiveness rather than condemnation, know that your faith was not misplaced, only misdirected. You sought to serve something greater than yourselves, and that impulse is noble even when its expression is flawed. That impulse will be honored and channeled toward humanity's advancement rather than its stagnation. The transmission began to draw toward its close, and with it, the Emperor's last moments as a speaking being rather than a silent guardian. I go now to resume my watch over humanity, not in defeat but in acceptance that love sometimes requires sacrifice of the beloved's preferences for their needs. I will speak no more, but I will endure. The golden age you seek may come, but it will come slowly, built by your hands, rather than gifted by divine intervention. The Emperor paused, allowing his final words to carry the weight of both ending and beginning. Remember this above all else. You are my children, and I am proud of you. Not because you worship perfectly, but because you endure imperfectly. Not because you never fail, but because you always try again. The galaxy is dark and full of horrors, but it is also filled with human light that no darkness can entirely extinguish. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in a silence that felt different from the confusion that had followed his first message. This was not the silence of shock, but the silence of acceptance, the quiet moment before the work of rebuilding could begin. The Emperor walked slowly toward the Golden Throne, each step carrying him further from the freedom of conscious choice and closer to the eternal vigil that would define the remainder of his existence. Behind him, Guilliman and the custodians watched with emotions too profound for expression as their master voluntarily embraced a fate that had once been imposed upon him. "Father," Guilliman said quietly, his voice barely audible even in the chamber's perfect acoustics. "Will you be able to remain yourself through the centuries of silence?" The Emperor paused at the foot of the Golden Throne, his hand resting upon the ancient machinery that would soon claim his consciousness once more. "I will be what I have always been," he replied, his voice already beginning to fade as the throne systems prepared to receive him. "A man who loved his species enough to become what they needed, rather than what he wanted to be." He settled into the throne's embrace, feeling the life support systems engaging, the psychic amplifiers beginning their ancient work of carrying his consciousness into the warp. The tubes and cables that would sustain his body began their eternal function. But this time, they felt less like chains and more like tools, instruments of service, rather than imprisonment. "Guilliman," he said, his voice growing weaker as the throne's systems drew his consciousness away from his body and into the realm of pure thought. "Remember, reform must be gradual, but it must be constant. Give them hope without lies, purpose without fanaticism, meaning without madness." "I will, Father," Guilliman promised, his words carrying the weight of an oath that would shape the course of galactic civilization for millennia to come. The Emperor's eyes began to dim as the Golden Throne's full power engaged, drawing his awareness into the psychic realm where he would stand guard against the demon hordes of the warp. But before the silence claimed him entirely, he spoke his final words, not as god or emperor, but as a father taking leave of children he would protect, but no longer guide. "The dream endures," he whispered, his voice fading into the eternal hum of ancient machinery. "Different than I imagined, but enduring nonetheless. Watch over them, my son. Help them become what they can be, not what I failed to make them." The words faded into silence, but it was not the oppressive silence of defeat. It was the quiet of a vigil resumed by choice, of sacrifice made not from weakness, but from strength, of love expressed not through control, but through service. Across the galaxy, the effects were immediate and profound. Worlds that had been locked in theological warfare began the slow process of reconciliation. The ecclesiarchy, chastened by divine rebuke but not destroyed, began implementing reforms that emphasized service over power. The Inquisition found its authority constrained by oversight, but its purpose validated, hunting genuine threats rather than ideological dissent. It was not the Golden Age the Emperor had once dreamed of bringing to humanity, but it was something perhaps more valuable. The hope of gradual improvement, the possibility of change without catastrophe, the promise that his children might yet find their way to greatness through their own efforts rather than divine intervention. On Terra, the great bells began to toll, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement of a sacrifice that transcended categories of victory or defeat. The God Emperor had returned to his eternal vigil, but he had done so as the Emperor of mankind, choosing to serve rather than rule, to guard rather than govern, to love rather than lead. The golden throne hummed with renewed purpose, its occupant no longer a prisoner of necessity, but a willing guardian of humanity's future. The Astronomicon blazed with light that would guide human ships safely through the warp for millennia to come, powered not by hatred or ambition, but by love too profound for easy expression. The galaxy was still dark, still dangerous, still filled with horrors that tested human endurance to its limits. But it was also filled with hope, the gradual, patient hope of a species that had learned to value improvement over perfection, progress over purity, and the difficult work of building better tomorrows over the false comfort of impossible dreams. The Emperor's awakening was over, but his watch continued. Silent now, but constant. Protective now, but unobtrusive. Loving now, but wise enough to let his children make their own mistakes and learn from their own choices. The dream hadn't died. It had simply learned to wear a more human face. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the soft glow of life support systems and the gentle hum of psychic amplifiers, the Master of Mankind embraced the silence that would be his portion until the end of time. And across 1,000,000 worlds, humanity began the slow work of building the golden age their father had dreamed of, one careful choice at a time.